little bit more at the angle there. Great, super, thanks. I think we just about got our good even exposure across here. Super. As a photographer, whether I am making a picture for myself or for a client, I am always directly involved in the design process. Like all aspects of visual design, photographic design requires planning and decision making. After I have an idea for a picture, I must look at my subject and decide what I want to emphasize, then plan on how to photograph it for maximum impact. In this program, we're going to explore what might be called the foundation of photographic design: camera choice, lens choice, framing, and selective focus. I call it camera vision. I have just completed a shot for a series of fashion photographs I'm working on, including these accessories. As you might expect, there were a number of decisions that had to be made before I was able to get this picture. But because I took the time to choose my tools carefully and make practical as well as creative choices, I am confident that I will get the results I want. One of the first decisions that you must make in the photographic design process is the choice of tools. Camera vision that is seen photographically will vary with the type of camera being used. Your choice may be a compromise between a camera you're most comfortable with and one that is best suited for the job. You may want to use a 35mm single lens reflex camera because it is convenient for action photography. Or you may use a medium format camera because of its larger negative size. This medium format camera is a 6x7, but it also has the ability with this film magazine to be able to shoot an image size of 2¼ by 2¼ square. Another advantage of this camera is its flexibility. You can expose part of a roll in color, then exchange the film compartment, and shoot more pictures in black and white. You may need both versions of the same photograph for different purposes. An excellent tool for the studio, especially product photography, is this view camera. It uses a 4x5" sheet film inside this film holder, which produces a negative that can be greatly enlarged. 16x20" or larger prints can be made without loss of image quality. The main advantage of the view camera is its ability to control the position and shape of objects on the ground glass through movements of the camera's front and back. These movements are just as useful for still life photographs as they are for architectural photographs. The view camera allows you to control the perspective of buildings and correct the distortion that you can get when using other types of cameras. The size of the film that the camera uses can be an important design consideration if your photographs are going to be greatly enlarged in their final form. When comparing the 3 film formats side by side, we can see that the smaller the negative, the more it must be enlarged to obtain a usable size. Like an 8x10" image, which might be required for a magazine illustration. An enlarged 35mm negative will often show visible grain and won't be as sharp as the larger formats. This may not be a problem if your photographs are destined for use in a magazine, but if the final result is going to be a poster or a mural, then you should consider a larger film format. Film formats have different proportions as well as different sizes. The 35mm picture is a longer rectangle than a 4x5" picture. Between the 35mm and the 4x5 cameras are several medium format cameras, which produce a variety of different image sizes with different proportions, including the popular 2¼ square format. The proportions of the film format, that is the shape of the format, will affect the way you compose your pictures. For example, a rectangular format stimulates our eye's movement inside the frame. Dynamic composition can be achieved without difficulty. The square format offers a unique design challenge. If not carefully composed, the photograph may appear static because its shape encourages our eyes to focus on the center of the picture. Therefore, design must be organized to increase the visual energy of the photograph. From the practical standpoint, the choice of camera and format may depend on the proportions of the photograph in its final content. In this magazine layout, the final shape of the picture will be square, so it doesn't make sense to shoot the picture with a 35mm camera because half of it would be cropped out. As you can see, a 2¼ 2¼ camera format will allow exact composition. For this ad, a rectangular format camera looks like the obvious choice, but some photographers prefer to work exclusively with the square format SLRs. By putting pieces of tape on the viewfinder screen, you could delineate the shape of the final picture and still have extra space in the negative that can be used to alter the composition at another time. Besides the choices of camera and thus the format, your camera vision is also dependent on the choice of lenses. Let's go on location outside the studio to have a look at the effects of different lenses on photographic scene. The lens is often described by its focal length in millimeters, or by its relative focal length, normal, short, or long. This 50mm lens is considered normal for this camera. The focal length is the distance between the lens and the focal plane. That is, the surface of the film when the lens is focused on affinity. At that distance, light rays reflected off a subject reach the focal plane in parallel lines. The focal length determines the angle of view seen through the lens, as well as the size of the image formed on the film. This is a normal lens which has a 47-degree angle of view. This is the same scene as viewed through a short or wide-angle lens, a 28mm. Although I have not changed my position, the model appears to be much further away. Also, the angle of view has increased to 73 degrees, and we see much more of the park. The model appears much the same seen through a longer than normal lens, 105mm. The model appears much closer because the lens forms a larger image on the focal plane. The angle of view is much narrower, only 23 degrees. For comparison, let's look again through the normal lens. This view is similar to the one our eye would see without looking through the lens. What about different cameras? Is a 50mm lens the normal lens for a medium format camera or 4x5 view camera? The answer is no, because a lens is considered normal if the focal length is about the same as the diagonal measurement of the film. Thus, a 43mm lens is normal for a 35mm camera. However, as we have already seen, my camera, typical of most 35mm SLRs, was fitted with a 50mm lens as standard equipment. Actually, lenses ranging from 40mm to 55mm are considered normal. A camera that uses a 2¼ 2¼ format is usually fitted with an 80mm lens as its normal lens. And a 4x5 view camera takes a normal lens in the vicinity of 150mm. Because a lens is considered the normal lens does not necessarily mean that it should become your most frequent choice. You need to experiment with various lenses in different photographic situations in order to determine the advantages and disadvantages of each. Let's look at some more characteristics of the short and long lenses. A short lens, like this 28mm, will give us a greater angle of view than a normal lens, and it will give us a greater depth of field. That is, a deeper area of acceptable focus from foreground to background. Although I have focused on the model, the foreground is in focus as well as the distant background. The extreme depth of field enhances the three-dimensional feeling of the picture, but this apparent depth of field can sometimes present problems in composition. In this picture, made from a different position, the lens has placed a very distracting background in focus. This characteristic of wide-angle lenses brings up an important point in regards to camera vision. Photographers must learn to see what's going on in the background elements. They must learn to neatly compress the chaotic three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional viewfinder. One simple technique that can be used to soften the effects of distracting backgrounds is the use of the aperture as the controller of the depth of field. This picture was shot at f/16, which maximizes the range of focus for this lens. But if we use the larger aperture, f2, we will greatly reduce the depth of field, throw the background out of focus, and make the foreground much easier to read. Another characteristic of short lenses that you should be aware of is distortion, both real and apparent. Real distortion is caused by thick pieces of glass used in the wide-angle lenses and is evident at the edge of the picture. Straight lines will appear curved near the outside of the frame. This effect becomes more pronounced on even shorter lenses. So if you use a wide-angle lens for architecture, for example, you should avoid placing verticals near the edges. The apparent distortion that frequently occurs with short lenses is one of perspective. Kelly, would you extend one of your legs, please? The wide-angle or short lens is capable of focusing very close to the subject, which causes this obvious distortion of perspective. The model's foot seems unnaturally large, while her body seems disproportionately small. If you switch to a longer lens, like this 105mm, you'll have to move further away from your subject to focus the image. Because of their narrow angle of view, long lenses can be used to draw attention to the important details of your scene. They also seem to compress space. Our model appears to be sitting much closer to the background than she does when we look at her with a normal lens, but the distance is the same. The 105mm lens is a good choice for the casual portrait situation like we have here, since the camera must be placed at a comfortable distance from the subject. Disadvantages of long lenses include their considerable bulk and weight. The longer they are, like this 200mm, the larger and heavier they get. If you have to hand-hold the camera and use a slow shutter speed, you may see evidence of camera movement. You'll probably need to shoot at 1/250th of a second or faster to avoid blurring the picture. Better yet, use a tripod. If you're not interested in collecting several different short and long lenses, you have the option of using one zoom lens, which incorporates a variety of focal lengths from short to long. The main advantage of the zoom lens is that without changing your position, you can alter the framing of your subject in order to dramatically change the composition of your picture. The disadvantages of zoom lenses include its greater size and weight. This 35 to 135mm zoom is larger and heavier than my 105mm lens, and the image quality may not be as high as individual lenses because the zoom lens needs several more glass elements which can soften the image. What angle of view do you want? How much depth of field do you need? How do you handle distortion or compression of space? You simply must experiment with several lenses, learn their idiosyncrasies, and you'll soon appreciate the range of options they provide. Once the photographer has camera and lens in hand, his primary design decisions are made with the frame in the camera's viewfinder. The frame is a critical design tool because it shapes not only the look of the photograph, the formal arrangement of visual elements, but also the content or emphasis. By framing the scene in this manner, the subject of the picture is the sculpture. We have made a simple, straightforward record of the artwork. By moving the frame, the photographer selects what to include in the picture and what to exclude. This creative choice affects the visual organization of the relationship between the objects and the people within the frame. A new relationship, a visual connection, has been created between the model and the sculpture. We now have an environmental fashion picture. With a slightly different framing, another relationship has been created with the inclusion of a third person in the picture. By altering the framing of the photograph, we have communicated three entirely different messages. The final choice, the edited choice, will depend upon what you want to say about this particular place and this subject matter. Of course, we have more possibilities than the three examples. We can use the frame to isolate a specific detail. For example, we may want to frame only the model, cropping out the background, to draw the attention to the dress, which is what our client is interested in promoting. Or we can move in to frame her head and shoulders so we can emphasize the glasses. The process of framing the entire scene or details within the scene is similar to a system of photography that is used in the motion picture industry. Camera shots are identified by how much of an average-sized person they include. A wide shot shows my entire figure with enough space at the top and the bottom that I don't appear cramped. A medium shot shows me from the waist to above the head. A close-up shows only my head and shoulders. An extreme close-up focuses on just a small portion of my head and can be used for dramatic effect. This cinematic version of framing can be adapted to the needs of the still photographer, especially when planning a series of photographs. We've looked at how the frame can be used to focus on details within a scene and how it creates a relationship between the objects that it surrounds. Now I'd like to illustrate in a studio situation how critical the frame is in determining the formal organization, the design of photographs. In this picture, the frame includes some blank space around the shoes, which draws our attention to their shapes. This is an example of what is called closed form, because the outline of the subject is emphasized. But when we move the frame in and crop into the shoes, we have an entirely different kind of picture. It does not say shoes as much as it simply says line and color. This is an example of open form because we know the object continues beyond the frame. Let's look at another example of how the frame can be used to enhance the subject matter. In this photograph, made with a normal lens, we first see the model's dress. Eventually, we are drawn to her handbag. While in this picture, made with a long lens, we have cropped out the edge of the dress so the handbag dominates. The dress has been abstracted. Its color and texture become its most important feature. In these framing examples, we have either looked at the subject while standing in one spot, or we've moved directly towards the subject from our original position. Of course, for every situation, there may be an infinite number of photographic angles possible. In addition to choosing how to frame a photograph from a single position, you may also find other positions which may prove more visually interesting. In other words, you must find the best vantage point. By changing your vantage point, you will alter the relationship between your subject and its background. By moving a short distance to one side, we'll remove the fountain and create a new environment by placing our model in front of the trees. She will now have a different contrast feeling. Changing your vantage point means taking another point of view or seeing from a different angle. From this angle, the man is now the dominant in the frame. The woman, who is slightly out of focus, becomes part of the background. We have given our fashion series a new emphasis, the man's clothes. You don't always have to look straight ahead when you're making a photograph, or keep your subject at eye level all the time. A high vantage point provides this interesting bird's eye view of our subjects. The camera now emphasizes the geometry of our scene rather than the objects within it. For a dramatically different angle, we can also look up at our subject. There is obviously some distortion here, but this point of view will attract more attention than this straightforward eye-level version. But this angle would be fine for a catalog photograph. Certainly, you have a great many choices for vantage point than simply very high, eye level, or very low. And each time your subject moves, there is a whole new range of options or design considerations. In a studio situation where space is limited, you may have fewer choices. But in still life photography, for example, a slight tilt of the camera can make a remarkable difference in the appearance of your subject. Let's have a look. In this product shot, the camera is looking down slightly at the bottles, so their tops are visible. The camera position approximates a view a person might have if the bottles were seen on a countertop. But if we lower the camera and look up at the bottles, the still life is much more imposing. It commands more attention. Because the objects are close to the lens, small changes in the camera's position will result in large changes in the shape of the objects. There is one other area of camera vision that we should explore at this time: the creative use of focus. When you're photographing a group of identical objects which cover the entire picture area, you have a couple of options. You can either maximize the depth of field by using a small aperture, or you can limit the depth of field with a large aperture and create a narrow band of focus. In this case, it does not make much sense to use a shallow depth of field to selectively focus on a portion of the bottles. Our eyes want to follow the lines from foreground to background, but they are held in the area that's sharp. But if we use a small aperture and focus about 1/3 of the way into the still life, we are able to achieve maximum depth of field. The result is more pleasing to the eye, which can now easily move over the bottles. On the other hand, limited focus can be used to advantage when you want to draw the eye to a particular object or a group of objects. Selective focus draws our attention to the foreground bottles and separates them from the others. By throwing part of the picture out of focus, we've created a good background for advertising copy. The type can easily be read over the indistinct bottles. If the entire picture is put into focus, the copy becomes more difficult to read because the background bottles compete for the attention of our eye. However, increasing the depth of field increases the impression of three-dimensional space in our two-dimensional picture. Selective focus can be used to create an impression of depth and draw the eye into the background, or it can help flatten space and keep the eye in a particular area. The latter usage is especially helpful when you're working on location with distracting backgrounds. In this situation, I must solve the design problems of various colors, irregular shapes, and movement behind the model. In this picture, with its great depth of field, the busy background competes with the model for visual attention. But if I use a larger aperture for a shallower depth of field, I can blur the background and draw more attention to my subject, the fashion. As we have seen, camera vision involves many choices. Of course, each decision in the photographic design process brings with it a great many ramifications. If you choose to work with a 35mm camera, how will that decision affect the practical and aesthetic matters all the way down the line, from the conception of your photograph to the final content? You should not let this decision-making process frustrate you. This is the area you can be the most creative. By experimenting with various cameras and lenses, with different ways of looking at your subjects and different methods of controlling the images you see, you will become more aware of your creative options. And the more you photograph, the more comfortable you'll become with certain ways of working. That's fine. But don't ignore new methods simply because they are unfamiliar. They may just help you improve your camera vision. The photographer, when composing a picture, must see the world as consisting not only of subject matter, like trees, but also an abundance of abstract forms, which consists of lines and shapes in the space that surrounds us. These forms also have texture and usually color. Pictures, drawings, paintings, or photographs are constructed or designed using the elements and principles of design. In this program, we'll discuss the design elements of line, shape, texture, and color, and the design principles of balance, composition, movement, emphasis, repetition, contrast, scale, and unity. The photographer, unlike the painter, however, normally does not add lines and shapes and other elements to his composition. Instead, he recognizes the elements in the environment, sees an arrangement of visual forms, and isolates them with his frame to structure the photograph. An exception to this method of photographic composition is photographers who add props strictly because of their formal properties. In this program, we're going to explore the use of these design elements and some principles which govern their use. Here we have an example of curved lines giving energy and movement to our pictures. The line of the model's back is an actual line, while the flowers seen together form an implied line. The curve of the flower rows lead us to the model, and her stance creates a similar line. We have seen a visual connection, a relationship. Of course, we don't have to rely only on curved lines to make interesting compositions. Straight lines are even more prevalent, especially in man-made environments. Vertical and horizontal lines, long, short, thick, and thin, are everywhere. And we'll often see diagonal lines which stimulate eye movement even more. But the photographer must recognize these lines and use them to his advantage to create interesting visual relationships. We've seen that lines give energy to pictures, but occasionally lines are static. Since there are no lines to move our eyes around the picture, they tend to remain near the top. With the addition of a new line, movement has been stimulated and we have a more interesting picture. And if we add another line, we can complement the angles below the horizontal to make the composition more complex. A fashion photographer working on location sees design elements in the environment and, like a director, adds other elements to complete his visual design. A photojournalist, if he's unable to direct his subject, must rely upon changing his vantage point and framing in order to organize the lines and shapes that he sees. Although we're looking at this picture in terms of lines that we have added, the shape of the dress may seem more dominant than its outline. This ambiguity between line and shape occurs frequently, but it's natural. Some people have a tendency to see shapes in their field of vision more easily than they see lines. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that photographers learn to perceive their subject matter in terms of abstract forms. Here we have an example of rectangular shapes forming the structure of our composition. As you could imagine, there are as many different shapes as there are lines to make them. Besides rectilinear, curvilinear, and other geometric shapes, we are surrounded by irregular shapes of all kinds. In this photograph, shapes have become the structural element of the composition. We see lines certainly, but the shapes dominate the composition. The photographer, by changing his vantage point or the focus of the picture, has much creative freedom. He can choose from a great many possibilities in his environment to make compelling photographic compositions. The challenge for the photographer, like all designers, is to make the proper judgments about the visual juxtaposition he sees. He must organize hard and soft lines, rough and smooth textures, or cold and warm colors into photographs which clearly communicate his message, whether it concerns advertising, news, or fine art. Space, what we see and feel around us at all times, is defined as the intuitive three-dimensional field of everyday experience. Space is selective and variable. In a small room like this, you may think you need more of it. In an open area like this, there seems to be ample space. We can determine depth in space because of our binocular vision. Each eye sees a slightly different two-dimensional view of an object. Our brain combines the two flat views into a single three-dimensional stereoscopic view of the world. We can thus place objects in our view in relative positions in space. The camera, however, is like a single eye and only sees the world as two-dimensional. Because the camera flattens space, we must avoid making this common mistake. The statue, even though we know it is much further away, appears to be standing on the shoulder of the model. Therefore, the photographer must carefully scan the background in order to avoid unwanted juxtaposition. In photographs, we can only achieve the illusion of depth by careful arrangement of visual elements on the picture plane, which is the two-dimensional surface of the viewfinder. In this example, the three-dimensional illusion was enhanced by the placement of one of the models in the near foreground, seemingly closer to the viewer. Without the foreground element, it is difficult to determine how far away the other model is standing. The feeling of apparent depth has been lost. The illusion of depth on the picture plane can also be created by using the same visual technique that is used in perspective drawings. The converging lines give us a feeling of receding space, the illusion of three dimensions. It looks as though we could walk right into the picture, which after all still has only two dimensions, height and width. If we remove the converging lines, the feeling of depth is greatly reduced, although there seems to be more space around the model. there is still one point of reference remaining that helps us see the depth in the picture, the horizon line, which is common to our everyday experience. The horizon line creates this foreground space, which makes us feel as though we could walk into the picture. If we lower the horizon line, we remove the foreground space. The picture now seems much flatter. Our eye tends to stay on the surface of the picture instead of being drawn into it. The photographer can also use his camera to increase or decrease the illusion of deep space in his photographs. With our lens set at a small aperture, we move past the front model to the model in the background. But if the lens is set at a large aperture, creating a short depth of field, our eyes will stay in the foreground. There is another area where space plays an important role in the photographic design. This picture appears to be abstract. We see no evidence of recognizable objects. It is pure form. However, if elements of space are introduced, we begin to place the form, which we now see as a skirt, in the real world. Our abstract photograph has been transformed into a representational one. Cameras, because they record precise visual information, are better suited in making representational or realistic views of the world rather than abstract pictures. Nevertheless, we've seen that the photographer must add his creative eye to the camera in order to make photographs that convincingly portray the space that surrounds us. Another design element that plays an important role in composition is texture. It's the visual equivalent to the sense of touch. The texture of surfaces are usually described as being smooth or rough, or by other words that approximate what they feel like, silky or knobby. When we look at the wall, we know that it has a rough texture and that our model's skin is smooth. But because of this flat lighting, the photograph does not communicate roughness or smoothness. In order to visually describe the texture of a surface, we must use a directional light that is almost parallel to the surface. Here the sun is just grazing the surface, emphasizing the peaks and valleys and communicating texture. Now we can feel in a visual sense the roughness of the wall, and contrasted to the rough texture, our model's skin looks very smooth. The final design element that we're going to look at is color, which is more complex and has more variations than any of the other elements that we have considered. Color is described in terms of its three perceptual dimensions: hue, lightness, and saturation. The hue is the pure state of color and indicates its place on the visible spectrum. Hues have the familiar names of red, yellow, green, blue, and so on. The photographer is concerned with hue because of the way it can be contrasted. For example, if we contrast a warm color like red or yellow against a cool color like blue or green, the effect is striking. In this case, the red dress appears to advance towards the camera while the blue dress appears to recede. The significance of hue contrast becomes evident when you must determine the positions of colors in your composition. Which should come forward, which should recede. Color perceptions and color control require experience. The dimension of value is the relative lightness or darkness of a color. Every hue has a range of progressively lighter or darker values, which extend in opposite directions from a middle value. The middle value of the color is equivalent to the middle gray of the gray scale that ranges from pure white to pure black. The lighter values of any color or gray will reflect more light than the darker values in proportion to their lightness or darkness. This is important to remember because reflected types of light meters, which are balanced for middle gray, will incorrectly measure the reflectance of light or dark values. Therefore, it's a good idea to use a gray card, which represents the middle value of all colors when metering a scene containing values of high contrast. Besides its relationship to exposure control, value contrast also affects photographic design because of the relative attraction of different colored values. For example, a light color will grab the attention of the eye before a dark color does. So a photographer must carefully place the values within a composition in order to control the movement of the viewer's eyes. The third dimension of color is intensity, which is sometimes referred to as chroma or saturation. The intensity of color indicates its relative purity or grayness. This magenta ranges from weak or grayish to strong or pure without any gray. Magenta and orange are colors of high intensity, while pink and beige, which contain more gray, are colors of low intensity. Although a technical knowledge of color dimensions is vital to the art and science of color design, photographers normally develop an intuitive understanding of color. By careful observation of their surroundings, they learn which colors advance and which recede, how light affects the values of colors, and how to balance colors in their photographic compositions. Of course, a photographer always has the option of switching from color to black and white, in which case he must learn a different way of seeing. The colors of objects and backgrounds must now be visualized in their equivalent gray values and composed for separation and contrast. If seen in color, the photographer must contrast hues and intensities as well as values. Color, or the lack of it, is simply another design consideration, like line, shape, space, and texture. The observant photographer sees them, isolates them, and gives them formal coherence in his viewfinder. If he organizes the elements effectively, his photographs will communicate. In order to feel confident with photographic composition, a photographer must understand certain design principles. The thoughtful organization of any picture is dependent not only on recognition of the design elements, but also the forces that affect them. Perhaps the most important design principle is balance. All effective visual compositions exhibit a feeling of balance or stability. Fortunately, most photographers are capable of making balanced compositions since we all possess a natural inclination for equilibrium. Integrating this need for a balance with our camera vision is simply a matter of recognizing and using an existing human characteristic. One type of visual balance is symmetrical. It exists when each side of the composition, divided in the center, is a mirror image of the other. All of the visual weights on one side of the picture reflect those on the other side. We have equilibrium. However, symmetrical balance is tenuous and can be lost easily. For example, different colors have different visual weights. The composition no longer feels balanced. Lighting can also affect the stability of our picture. In this flat light, the picture is symmetrical, but if the sun comes out, dark shadows are created on the side of the picture. The shadows add more visual weight to that side and throws the picture out of balance. Of course, we don't have to accept an unbalanced picture if we can't find a symmetrical arrangement. We simply look for or create an asymmetrical balance. Although the picture lacks symmetry, it is still balanced because the visual weight of the umbrella now counteracts the weight of the shadows. In fact, this asymmetrical version has more energy than our original symmetrical composition, which tends to be static since the eye does not easily move around the frame. We are compelled to fixate on the umbrella in the center. Most photographs we make are going to be asymmetrical composition, simply because there's not much uniformity in the world. Achieving balance is a creative challenge. This picture, with the models grouped together, feels too heavy on the left. By positioning our male model on the right side of the frame, we'll balance the composition and create an interesting relationship between the models and the fashions. Determining balance in your photographs is more of an intuitive process than a rational one. It does require that you try different arrangements or framings of a subject and different vantage points. Ultimately, you must evaluate your results and decide intuitively which one feels best. There are, however, rational methods of composition that should be mentioned. The most common is based on the golden mean, a system of proportions devised by the ancient Greeks. The rule of thirds advises that important visual elements be placed at the intersection of grid lines or along any of the lines. Some photographers visualize the grid on their viewfinders as a starting point for their compositions. Another compositional rule, that of strategic placement, states that you should never bisect an image, either vertically or horizontally. Instead, principal dividing lines should be placed away from the center lines to avoid static compositions. Most photographers will make these visual judgments intuitively, especially after they've practiced balancing the visual weights in their viewfinder. Earlier I mentioned that diagonal lines stimulate movement of the eye. Movement, like balance, is a design principle that photographers should consider when composing the pictures. In photographs, as in paintings, movement can only be implied. Only in film and video can movement, like walking, actually be expressed. Let's have a look at some of the factors that can imply movement in pictures. This is a relatively motionless photograph. Our eyes seem to concentrate on the verticals within this picture. If we add some diagonal lines to this arrangement, we can create a much more dynamic picture. Our eye now moves diagonally across the frame to the open umbrella, back to the lower left corner, then back to the right again. In other words, we are interested in looking at the picture with diagonals for a longer period of time than the original version. A photographer must use design techniques creatively in order to keep the viewer's eye within the picture. Normally, if we frame a portrait with more space behind our subject's head than in front of it, our eye is directed out of the picture. This type of placement is usually more satisfying. Our eye movement is contained within the frame. There are exceptions to this rule, like any other. If we add another subject on the right, we create a new relationship. Our attention now shifts back and forth between the two models. We have created visual movement. Another design principle that is used frequently by photographers is emphasis. It means that one or more of the visual elements are given predominance over the others within the picture. In this photograph, there is no real emphasis. Each subject seems to be equally important. But if we move one of the subjects back, our attention is focused on the other one. She is given predominance. We still look at the model in the background for comparison, but our eye always settles on the foreground model. We can create a hierarchy of emphasis by placing similar elements in a deep spatial relationship. Our eyes move into the picture, but they return to the picture plane and the most predominant element. However, we can always change the emphasis of the photograph by using the technique of selective focus. We must remember that the photographer can alter his design by arranging visual elements within the frame and by changing the way the camera sees those elements. The design principles of repetition offers a simple method of adding visual interest to a photographic composition. However, if design elements are repeated endlessly, repetition can easily become redundant. Without any other element to focus on, we look only at the horizontal pattern that soon becomes dull. One solution is to include a similar element that gives our eye some visual relief from the repeated elements. Another option is to add a dissimilar element. that contrasts with the original motif in order to create some variety. This brings us to the design principle of contrast. Earlier we discussed various examples of color contrast and their effects on composition. We see it again here. In fact, any design elements can be contrasted with different examples of its type to form compelling visual relationships. For example, straight lines and curved lines, rectilinear shapes and curvilinear shapes, or rough and smooth textures. Contrast plays an important role in another design principle, that of scale. The scale of an object, its relative size, can only be determined by the juxtaposition with another object. Without any familiar reference points, it is difficult to determine the actual size of this truck. With the addition of a second element, we understand the proportions. Scale is of particular interest to architectural photographers who must visually communicate the dimensions of a structure. A viewer looking at this photograph may have trouble understanding the size of the building until we add a human figure. If we assume the figure is about 6 foot tall, we can make a rough approximation of the height of the structure. Our final design principle is one that encompasses all of our discussion in this program. It's called unity, and it's defined as the arrangement of all the elements in a design or photographic composition so that each contributes to a unified aesthetic effect. It implies integration and harmony. A photograph possesses unity when nothing in the composition needs to be changed. Unity can be achieved in photographs by noticing first if there are existing elements that distract from the integration of the composition. In this example, our eye is distracted from the center of interest, the fashions, by the bright upper corner. It leads us out of the picture. By reframing the picture, we can remove the distraction and make the arrangement more harmonious. However, by doing so, we have also affected the other visual relationships, perhaps more than we wanted. The picture feels slightly askew. By moving the models over, we have again balanced the picture and given it unity. Now let's briefly review several design elements and principles again. First, we have the element of line, actual and implied. Shape, rectilinear and curvilinear. Space, two-dimensional and the illusion of three-dimensional space. Texture, both smooth and rough, which is emphasized by directional light. And color, with its dimensions of hue, value, and saturation. Design principles include balance, both symmetrical and asymmetrical. Movement, emphasis, contrast, scale, and unity, which means the harmonious integration of all parts of your photograph. Good composition depends on the recognition of visual elements in the world around us and their arrangement within the viewfinder's frame. Finally, the content of the picture, the message, will determine the most effective composition. If the photograph communicates clearly and forcefully, then it is properly composed. Light, whether from a natural source or an artificial one, is a principal design tool of the photographer. Light affects the way we perceive the world around us and the objects in our everyday lives. The photographer can manipulate light to increase the drama of ordinary things or illuminate chosen objects while obscuring others. The photographer can use light to affect the color relationships of objects in his picture and thus change our perception of the colors and our emotional response to them. In this program, we're going to look at a variety of ways a photographer can use light creatively in photographic design. And since color is so closely associated with light, our perception of color changes as the light changes. We will also discuss some of the psychological and aesthetic aspects of color. In our exploration of light and color, we'll be looking at examples of light direction, light quality, controlling light and color, and the psychology of color, both in the studio, where the photographer is in complete control, and outdoors, where we must adapt to the existing quality of light. Let's look first at the visual effects of light direction. If we use front lighting on our studio still life, we mean that the light source is positioned near the camera and illuminates only the front of our subject. Front lighting reduces the three-dimensional look of the objects and destroys the illusion of depth of the photograph because the shadows aren't visible. It also tends to wash out the textures of the surfaces. In a portrait situation, front lighting seems to flatten the features of our model. Quarter lighting, often called 45-degree lighting, is common in portraits, primarily because of its modeling characteristics. The light, however, is normally raised above the horizontal. If we move the lamp another 45 degrees in the same direction, we have side lighting or split lighting. With side lighting, we pick up even more texture on our still life object. We also create a division between light and shadow, which runs down the center of the objects. In a portrait, this division can create an imbalance unless the composition is slightly altered to compensate for the increased visual weight of the shadow. In an outdoor portrait, strong sunlight from the side creates high contrast and deep shadows, which may turn black if you expose for the important highlights. It may be necessary to use a reflector to bounce some of the light onto the opposite side to soften the shadow. This light still provides good modeling. Side light, or any light direction, is dependent upon the relative position of the camera and the subject. For example, in this aerial photograph, the sun at a low angle works as a side lighting to emphasize the contour and texture of the land. In a studio situation, we may consider any light as side light if it emphasizes the texture on the aspects of the objects which are facing the camera. Side lighting is often used for still life and close-up subjects because the appearance of texture almost convinces us that we can reach into the picture and feel the surface quality. If we move the light source behind the subject, we create backlighting, which is occasionally used for its unique effects. The most familiar application of backlighting is the silhouette, when only the outlines of our subject are visible. Silhouettes are made by exposing for the light source and thereby removing all or nearly all visible detail from the subject. If the light is not carefully positioned outside the camera's field of view, some extraneous light may creep into the picture at the edge. When working outdoors with backlighting, you can usually shield your lens from the sun with your hand. But most of the time you'll probably want to expose for the main subject, especially in portrait situations. The beauty of this kind of backlight is evident. The colors are soft and a warm outline surrounds our model's head and shoulders. Also, there are not any shadows cast on her face. Top light like this from the midday sun is not so flattering because of the dark shadows underneath the eyes and the nose. Also, the highlights on the forehead and the nose are quite hot. With the use of a reflector, we can bounce the sunlight into the face and lighten the shadows. Light direction, of course, cannot be divided merely into a few categories, such as front, quarter, side, back, and top. The variations of these directions and the design possibilities are infinite. However, you will probably better appreciate the creative potential of light direction if you first practice with and understand the effects of these basic directions, both outdoors and in the studio. When we speak of the mood of a photograph, we are actually referring to the quality of light in the picture. Light quality is primarily determined by the size of the light source. Bright sun is considered a small source and produces what is called a hard lighting or direct lighting. The main characteristic of hard lighting is that it casts dark, distinctly outlined shadows. The shadows also give us a clear indication of the light's direction. Hard lighting, because of its well-defined shadows, creates many small, bright highlights on glossy textured surfaces like water or even apples and oranges. In the studio, the spotlight serves as the small source. In addition to being the best type of light to use if you want to accentuate texture, it also is the choice for maximum color contrast. Hard lighting will make the red and the orange as brilliant as they can be. The appearance of objects and their shadows change constantly when the light is directional yet diffused. Like the quality of light from a window, provided no sun comes through. This directional, diffused, or medium source light produces medium-sized highlights. Its shadows are lighter and have softer edges. If you want to work with artificial light, you can produce directional diffused lighting with a large reflector which simulates a medium source of a window. This type of light has good modeling characteristics, so it is often used for studio portraits. Outdoors, you can find a similar light quality when the sun filters through thin clouds. Although the sunlight is softened, the effect is usually transitory. You simply cannot control the movement of the clouds. When we compare hard lighting and directional diffuse lighting side by side, the differences between the highlights and the shadows become evident. A complete gray cloudy sky serves as a large source and gives a flat or fully diffused light quality. The sunlight is spread over the entire sky, filtered through the heavy cloud cover, and is reflected off a multitude of surfaces. What we see are very light shadows, almost non-existent, with very soft edges. The highlights, though large in area, are not strong. Flat, fully diffused light seems to wrap around our model. It softens the facial features and smooths the complexion by removing the shadows. Color contrast is very low under this kind of light, and many colors are quite dull, so only the brightest colors are going to stand out. These overcast skies are perfect for photographing shiny objects like automobiles because the reflections are soft and easy to look at. In the studio, flat lighting can be duplicated by bouncing light off of walls or shining it through translucent material. Using very soft filtered light on the studio still life will reduce the glare from the reflections and make the silverware more attractive. A thorough understanding of the practical effects of light direction and the various qualities of different light sources is a requirement for any advanced photographer. More important is the ability to control light. Through creative control of artificial and natural light, the photographer gains the freedom to make any photograph that his power of imagination will allow. In the studio, I have numerous tools at my disposal which control light in different ways. There's a lot of equipment here, which we'll look at a little later, that many photographers may not need to use at all, especially if you prefer working only with the natural light. So let's go outside and see if we really do have any controls over the existing light from the sun. Perhaps the natural light photographer does not control light as much as he appreciates the effects of different light's directions and qualities, and takes advantage of what each has to offer. For no matter what the day has to offer, the light is suitable for photographing some aspect of your subject. A photographer should be thoroughly familiar with his camera and lens and feel comfortable with quick, intuitive judgments about his composition, so he could act instinctively at the right moment. When light enhances a particular feature of your subject, patience is necessary because the weather doesn't always cooperate, and we must wait minutes, hours, or days for that perfect light. If the clouds have passed and it's now a bright sunny day, you may want to take advantage of it. All you have to do is to realize that this kind of light will really bring out the color contrast, but it could be a little too dark on the shadow side. So let's bring in a reflector. We'll fill in just a little bit on the shadow side, which will help emphasize the color contrast. Perhaps the shadows are the most interesting graphic effect of hard lighting from the sun or any small source. Shadows can be used creatively in a number of ways. Here, lines and shapes of the shadows are the dominant visual element of the composition. The strong color contrast between the dress and the stairs also create visual interest. If you tire of working in the harsh, direct sunlight, you have an option. You can move your subject underneath the open shade of a tree like this, or around the shade of a building. In this flat light, you must recognize the visual elements to draw more attention to the subject rather than the graphic effect of the shadows. In a visually complex environment such as this one, hard light from a bright sun only complicates a photograph. There are too many small highlights and shadows, and too much glare. Our picture is simply too busy. We must wait for better light. The colors of our subject are much easier to see in this lower contrast light because they do not have to compete with the background, which has been simplified. Simplification is the chief advantage of flat lighting, and it's a good reason to choose overcast days instead of sunny days if your subject or location contains a variety of textures and patterns. Although a photographer may not have the complete control over natural light, he certainly can be alert to variations in the quality of light and use them to his advantage. If colors are quiet, dull, under dark clouds, even rain, then they can be magnified under late afternoon and early evening sun. Many photographers prefer to work outdoors only at this time of day because the sun, filtered through the Earth's atmosphere, warms up the colors of everything it touches. In most circumstances, you'll want to take advantage of this very warm light to make a photograph that invokes a very appealing, rich mood. If that's your objective, then you won't need to use light balancing filters, which can change the color temperature of your scene. Sometimes, however, you may want to neutralize the warm light by adding a cooling filter such as a light blue 82C. This will remove some of the red light and make the colors look like they would under a midday sun. Whites will appear whiter. Of course, if you lose the sun and you must photograph again under the cloudy skies, or rain, you may want the opposite effect. The light now has a bluish cast, which is rather dull. By adding a light balancing filter, such as a pale orange 81C, you lower the color temperature of the source. That is, you add warmth to the colors. With these filters, the yellowish 81 series or the bluish 82 series, you can control the color balance of your photographs without having to wait for the sun to move or change. Before you begin experimenting with filters, you may first want to photograph in all kinds of light without colored filters. If you are careful and look at the effects of the subtle variations of light direction and quality, you will develop a very discerning eye for light. And by photographing the same subject from the same angle in as many different kinds of light as possible, you will learn a great deal about the relationship between light and color. Better yet, repeat the exercise with several subjects having different color combinations. Controlling natural light outdoors depends mainly on the photographer's decision of when and where to photograph for a given lighting condition. In the studio, the photographer stays in one location and controls a wide range of artificial lighting options to achieve a particular quality of light. At first glance, there looks as if there's too many lighting choices. You should remember, though, that despite the apparent complexity of artificial lighting systems, your primary objective is still quite simple. Control the direction and the quality of the light that falls on your subject. A single light, in this case a tungsten light, can be used to imitate the light from the sun. It's called the main or key light source, and it can be placed anywhere around the subject to duplicate any direction of sunlight. Ron, let's start with front light, please. And now, let's try some 45-degree lighting. And now some split lighting. And how about some top lighting? If we use only the main light to provide backlighting, our subject will appear as a dark shape unless we throw additional light into the shadow. We can do this with a second lamp, the fill light. It simulates the ambient light found outdoors that is reflected onto the subject by the surrounding environment. The fill light is always positioned close to the camera so that a second shadow remains hidden from view. This conforms to our understanding of sunlight, which produces a single shadow. Our main light, the artificial sun, is closer to the subject and brighter. If for some reason you don't have a fill light source available, we can use a white card as we did outdoors. The reflector bounces light from the main source onto the shadow side of our model's face. Obviously, there are much more complex lighting arrangements. Lights can be added to achieve any specific effect. For example, a small spotlight can be set up behind the model to emphasize the texture and sheen of her hair, or a small floodlight can be hidden behind the subject and directed directly on the background to illuminate the background. But all lighting setups are just variations of the most basic one. Main light, the principal illumination, which represents the sun, and the fill light, which modifies the shadow and represents natural ambient light. Perhaps the best advice is to start with the most simple lighting system. Discover the design possibilities of one or two lights before moving on to more complex setups. One simple tool for controlling your lighting are these barn doors. They help direct light away from the areas of your picture that we wish to keep in shadow. Another controlling device is this diffuser, which clips onto the light. As its name suggests, it can change the hard, direct light of our tungsten light into a directional diffused light source. For an even more diffused light, it is necessary to spread the light from the source over a larger area. That is what a white umbrella attached to a lamp can do. Or these light banks, or soft boxes, which produce a very soft, flattering light. These lights are very popular with fashion and product photographers who prefer diffuse lighting rather than strong, directional lighting. Light also can be controlled in the studio by using sources of different types. Photofloods, which are the cheapest and easiest to use, generate heat and change the color of their light as they get older. Quartz halogen lights are more expensive. They also generate heat, but their light quality is more consistent than that of floods. Electronic flash units are even more expensive, but they have long lives. Another advantage of electronic flash is that you can stop action in the studio and still have a cool light source. Another method of controlling light which frequently involves flash is the process of mixing light. Earlier, we used a reflector to lighten the shadows caused by hard direct sunlight. We can also use the flash for the same purpose, by mixing it with the sunlight. The color temperature of the flash is relatively close to that of the sun at this time of day, so that artificial and natural sources mix well. However, in the warmer light of late afternoon, the difference between colors from the flash and the sun are noticeable. The light from the flash is cooler. A similar mixing situation occurs when using artificial light from a table lamp and the natural light from a window. The window light acts as the main light since it is stronger, and the table lamp is the fill. In this case, also there is a noticeable difference in the color temperature of the two sources. A solution, if you're not satisfied with the light mix, would be to warm up the daylight by covering the window with a large 85 sheet filter. This is usually too expensive and too much trouble, so you might want to look for an alternate solution, like using a flash to fill the shadow side, or replacing the lamp's bulb with a blue photo flood. This will balance the two light sources. Another common light mixing problem is that of combining natural light from a window with fluorescent light. If you photograph this scene with daylight film, the uncorrected fluorescent lamps will look green and throw a greenish cast on the objects beneath, despite the light from the window. By using a color compensating filter, such as an FLD, with the D indicating daylight film, you can remove most of the green from the picture and give it a more natural look. There are times when you might want to enhance the dominant color of your scene rather than to neutralize it. Before beginning to experiment with color enhancement or neutralization, you should understand how different colors will stimulate different responses to photographs. Photographers who are interested in designing photographs that communicate persuasively should be aware of the psychological impact of the colors they choose. In general, warm colors like brilliant reds or oranges excite people, and cool colors like blues and greens relax them. There's an interesting story about Knute Rockne, that famous football coach from Notre Dame. This sly fellow understood the power of color. Mr. Rockne painted his team's locker room red to keep them excited and anxious to win, but the visiting team's locker room blue, so they would be instinctively relaxed and, it was hoped, be less aggressive when they reached the playing field. Color very definitely affects our moods. We are likely to be cheerful on a bright sunny day, but can be quite gloomy or depressed on a cloudy gray day. Our responses to color are more impulsive, more immediate than they are to other design elements like line and shape. which arouse more intellectual responses. For example, this colorless hexagon does not stimulate our attention as much as this red square, which has immediate impact and suggests that a familiar sign would work just as well if it were a different shape. The dynamic effects of color are seen in all types of product design and advertising. Boxes of soap are given hot, garish colors which shout for the attention of the consumer. On the other hand, the pastels of these perfume boxes whisper romance to the prospective buyers. And a soft drink may promise cool comfort using blues and greens in its ad. Photographers can direct their images to specific groups if they know that most extroverted people are content in colorful surroundings, while most introverted people are more comfortable in environments with subdued colors. Warm environmental colors normally reinforce our connection with our surroundings, while cool colors persuade us to withdraw into ourselves. In short, the emotional effect of color is strong. Photographers, therefore, may want to consider how their choice of colors will create a specific psychological response, as well as the intended graphic composition. The most significant fact to remember about color composition is that warm colors seem to advance and cool colors seem to recede. The red dress commands our attention and seems closer than the blue dress, but actually they are the same distance from the camera. Because of the relative attraction of different colors, their strategic placement in the composition becomes a primary concern of photographic design. The arrangement of the objects in this still life seems slightly imbalanced, but if we trade this warm color for this cool one, we have a better distribution of the visual's weight. Although this still life appears balanced, there seems to be a struggle for power among several strong colors. By simplifying the color relationship, we have made a more appealing photograph. Our eye moves easily over the objects. And when an isolated color appears in an otherwise monochromatic setting, we are attracted to the contrastive color. It becomes the center of interest. As we have mentioned, color contrast, especially the contrast of hues, play an important role in photographic design. For example, although this yellow outfit stands out against the orange background, it appears even brighter when contrasted against a passive gray. Yellow is a unique color in that it is even brighter than red, which dominates most color combinations. Yellow is also brighter than white, which is more visible than any other color in a photograph. So even if our model in the white dress is closer to the camera, our eyes will constantly be drawn back to the yellow dress. Of course, we must remember that color contrast varies with the quality of light. The yellow contrasts nicely with the green tree in the warm sunlight, but it will seem even more luminous on a gray day when the green background is more subdued. It is true that the photographer can predict that warm colors will appear more vibrant in comparison to cool colors in flat lighting, or that cool colors will become more brilliant under hard lighting. But light and color relationships are so complex and so subtle that the photographer must take time to observe natural light at work outdoors and experiment in the studio by controlling light direction and quality. By carefully looking, then seeing how light affects different objects and their colors, you will gain the knowledge necessary to make it work for you. See, that's just great. That's super. Thanks, Lori. I'll be right back. Hi, I'm Brian Ratty, and for over 25 years, photography has been my profession. Making pictures has been very good to me. I've traveled most of the world photographing people, places, and things. Over the years, I've developed a deep respect for other photographers and for people who wish to improve their communication skills through better photography. A few years ago, we began developing the On Assignment video series for photographers. Today, this award-winning series can be found in 20 countries in 6 different languages throughout the world. These videos are packed with easy-to-understand information on how you can improve your photography. There are literally hundreds of tips, secrets, and illustrations on better photographic technique. Let me share with you what has taken me 25 years to learn. I hope you'll get an opportunity to view one of our video programs in the very near future. Here are just a few of the subjects covered within the On Assignment video series.